Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we get some good news on Gary Trent Jr. We think we get good news on Khris Middleton as well. And Bradley Beal shares some details on what was a very interesting summer for him and why it almost landed him in Milwaukee a year ago. We'll get to that conversation coming up next here on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. Free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find us on YouTube as well, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, Camille, we mentioned on yesterday's show we expected to get updates on Gary Trent Jr., potentially Khris Middleton as well, when the Bucks had their media availability earlier in the day on, well, time is now becoming a flat circle, but Tuesday. And we did, in fact, get that. And I think the news is even better than we could have imagined on Gary Trent Jr. I don't know about you, but I was already setting myself up for, okay, he's going to miss a little bit of time at the start of the season. Maybe he's not ready for opening night. And Doc Rivers had said, yeah, it's not a big deal. He might even play on Thursday.
Which surprised me, just hearing like, yeah, the MRI didn't need to do that. He's going to be all right. Might play by Thursday. And I was just like, wow. Like for a second there, we were really worried, like, oh, our brand new, prize free agent pickup from this summer. We're not going to see him for a while. And again, I was hoping that it wasn't anything super serious for Gary Trent Jr., hoping it was like a stinger or something like that. So to hear that he might be good to go on Thursday was such good news. Although I'm sure there's a subset of people who are just like, good that he's healthy. Do we really need to see him anymore in the preseason? But I'm always here for guys getting in some preseason reps ahead of the season, especially given the fact that Doc's looking to install some new things. So real good news on the Gary Trent Jr. front that, the injury is not that serious, and it doesn't sound like he'll miss any time leading up into the regular season here.
Excellent news, I think, is the way to put it here for the Bucks. And look, if Gary Trent Jr., if this was year number 2 with the Bucks, then I would say, hey, you know what, just take the rest of the preseason off. But I do think it's important, as we saw last year, to develop that chemistry. And I know he's got it with Dame already, but just the rest of his teammates. And you want to see how these things start to piece together. As much as we said, the install, as Doc Rivers said, isn't there yet offensively in other places, but it's not as though they're just coming out here punting. You're picking up on some little things. So I think that is important. The other piece of news, which I guess we hesitate to say good news because it starts to feel a little bit like deja vu, but Doc Rivers was very optimistic about Khris Middleton's status and Giannis. I suppose we should get that part of the way too. It seems like Giannis is probably going to play tomorrow night, Thursday night in the preseason home debut for the Bucks. And I think he said the plan was for Khris Middleton to play in 2 games, hopefully in the preseason, which I think goes against what a lot of Bucks fans were assuming, and that probably won't see Khris in the preseason. We may not see him at the start of the season. So on the surface, good news. If Doc is saying, yeah, we think we're going to have him for 2 games, not sure if that's Thursday or if it's the last 2 games of the preseason. But I think where you're at least on guard is, yeah, I heard a lot of that last year with the ankle injury where Doc kept telling us he's close. It's any game now. I don't know when, but it's going to be very close. And we saw how long that dragged on. And Adrian Griffin before him as well, when Khris was kind of ramping up, took a while. We heard a lot of the same verbiage.
Yeah, I'm just happy that we don't have to keep hearing soon. I'm hoping we don't have to keep.
I don't know how soon, but soon. Yeah.
That was quite an exercise, and just trying to be patient about how soon is soon. Like I know time can be relative to people, where it's like my soon is a couple days, your soon is a couple of weeks. But in this case, I mean, just hearing the fact that Khris Middleton has the chance to possibly play in the last 2 preseason games for the Bucks is really encouraging news, because we've heard all throughout the offseason, like when the bomb was dropped on us, that he got the double ankle surgery during summer camp, or summer league, I should say, where it was like, wait, what happened? And then you get into training camp as that's opening with media day, and you're hearing Doc and you're hearing John Horst just mention like, hey guys, he's looking good. Like, we're just kind of holding him out. Like, he wants to go. We heard from Doc Rivers a few days into training camp how Khris was sneaking into some of the live drills and he just wanted to be on the court.
Had to kick him out, and
right, had to kick him out, get him out of there. But it was one of those things where it's like everything we've heard about it, although we haven't gotten the full picture, it sounds mostly positive, in a sense of like, we are just trying to manage Khris. We understand what's going on. We're not worried about it. We just want to make sure that we're doing things that are going to put him in the best position to be healthy and ready to go come playoff time. So again, I think it's really good news to hear that there's a chance that he could play, even if he doesn't play. Like, just knowing that he is that close
that
to
the door's not automatically shut on it.
Exactly. Where for me, it's just kind of like, okay, like that's some good news that we're rolling into the regular season starting, since, that's just a couple of weeks away in itself. So it's more important for Khris to be ready when the games actually count than anything else. But of course, if he can get some reps in during the preseason, that'll be a big positive as well.
At the risk of angering is not the right word, but just going against the prevailing thought of a lot of Bucks fans, because much to my belief, or not, the opposite of much to my surprise, kind of expected that was going to be the reaction of the show that we had yesterday, and looking at the comments of not a whole lot of support for a Pat Connaughton bounce back season. I'm assuming this is going to be met with the same resistance in the comments and social and by Bucks fans, but I'm not worried about Khris Middleton this season, especially because of Damian Lillard and because of everything that we've heard and that extra year or time that he and Giannis had together last year. And same with Doc Rivers, that you're not just learning on the fly, because that's what stood out the most to me at media day. When you go back there, is nobody came out and bluntly said we were miserable, things were terrible, it was one of the worst experiences I had. But if you read between the lines, I don't think the reality is too far off from that, with everything that we heard players say on the podium, and perhaps more importantly, what we did not hear them say. So with all of that out of the way, Giannis and Dame, I think that partnership is in a much better spot in terms of their chemistry and what you can expect. And we mentioned this last year at the time of the trade. I understand everything you're losing defensively, but the addition of Damian Lillard, in theory, gives you the opportunity to take your time with Khris Middleton, because you're not saying, Khris, you have to be the number 2 scorer and provide a lot of offense for us, because you got Damian Lillard. And especially what we saw from Dame in that first quarter, albeit of a preseason game, you just get the sense of, yes, this is going to be a much different Damian Lillard season. And that means if it's no back-to-backs, if it's he plays one game, he misses one game, whatever the plan is, I think that's perfectly fine until you get to the playoffs.
Yeah, man, you don't have back-to-backs in the playoffs, so that's never been anything that I personally worried about. I mean, to your point about the role that Khris has now that Dame is on board, that's also a big part as to why I am personally not as worried about it, because again, Khris is a super important part to this team, and I don't want to like try to make light of what his role is, but I think for me, and part of why I don't understand some of the consternation around Khris Middleton, is because he is now like the third offensive option on this team. If it was like it was before with Jrue Holiday on the team, where you're counting on Khris as your second guy, then I would have a few more concerns about his health, about what's going on with him, but understanding that, this is Giannis and Dame's team first and foremost, and then other shots go from there. With Khris being higher in the pecking order than others for sure, but yet and still, like, the team's shot creation isn't reliant solely on Chris's shoulders. You have Damian Lillard, and seeing how he started that preseason game, I don't expect him to shoot like 60% from 3 or anything like that, but he looks like he is a lot more comfortable being on the court with the Bucks and just ready for the season. So that bodes well for the team. And all in all, what I'm concerned about is just getting them through the season healthy, for them to have enough time on the court together to understand their chemistry, to understand scheme, and to be able to rock and roll come playoff time. So happy about Khris, happy about Gary Trent Jr., and also happy to hear that Giannis is going to be making that preseason debut on Thursday. Cannot wait to see him play again.
Leave your thoughts in the comments about Khris Middleton. Are you optimistic? Are you thrilled to hear this update from Doc Rivers, or are you just in the believe it when I see it mindset here? And Gary Trent Jr. as well, because I think not just you and I, Camille, Bucks fans too, I think we're all prepping for not a long-term injury per se, but not Gary Trent Jr. might already play in a couple of days. So very, very good news on that front. It does figure to be a Khris Middleton heavy show because of the other piece of news that we got. And, albeit I think we already knew most of this, but we're hearing it firsthand from one of those players involved in this news. And that was the trade that wasn't a year ago. Bradley Beal had some very interesting things to say about his time in Phoenix, about his thoughts, where that Suns team is headed, and the trade that would have made him a member of the Milwaukee Bucks. So we'll revisit those comments coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is sponsored by BetterHelp. Halloween lets us all have fun with what scares us. But what about those fears that don't involve zombies and ghosts? Therapy is a great tool for facing your fears and finding ways to overcome them. Because sometimes the scariest thing is not facing our fears in the first place and holding ourselves back. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do to get started is fill out a brief questionnaire, and then you'll get matched with a licensed therapist and can even switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, Camille. The news that we talked about with Bradley Beal, pretty sure we knew this last year, or you could at least deduce it based on what we were hearing. If we go back to the summer, we heard the intel that, hey, the Bucks were in on Bradley Beal and it kicked the tires there, and we're one of the teams to monitor. And I think as you started to do things and do the math in your head, I think you started to think, okay, well, Khris or Jrue Holiday, depending on the contract. And we heard more clarity on it from Bradley Beal on whose podcast was it even? I didn't even catch that.
I know it was the Title League. I forget the name of the actual, I think it's Run Your Race. I think it's the name of it.
So on an appearance on that show, Bradley Beal said he almost went to the Bucks, that it was basically down to the Miami Heat and the Milwaukee Bucks. When you think about the summers for those two teams and how interesting it was, but Miami pulled out at the last minute and said, nah, we're not interested, which presumably was, let's save all of our assets for Jrue Holiday for Damian Lillard or something else down the road. And the Bucks remained in on it. I know there's been other things kicked around of, well, it was actually Bradley Beal's wife that didn't want to come to Milwaukee. But as Bradley Beal said, he got cold feet because he learned it would be Khris Middleton that he would be traded for. And I have to go back and look at the timeline of all of this just to have a better understanding, because as Bradley Beal said, because that was one of our things of, well, Khris would have the contract, but he's technically a free agent. And Bradley Beal said, well, he had to opt into his contract and then he would have been traded to the Wizards. And as he even joked, like, who wants to do that you opt in and you're traded to DC? But Bradley Beal says it was his decision. And remember, he has a no trade clause. It was his decision to not do it because at the last minute, he just felt like, I don't know what that says about the loyalty if they're going to be trading Khris Middleton for me. So I guess level of surprise and your thoughts on that, on something that we heard they were interested in, but hearing the context that Bradley Beal added.
It was fascinating to me. Like, that's the first word that came to mind, just listening to him just talk about the inner workings of what happened with that trade. Now, I don't know if I'm believing every single thing that he said straight up about the reasons why he chose not to come to Milwaukee after all, so on and so forth, because at the end of the day, he did have a no trade clause. So
Yeah.
it was going to be based on what he wanted to do. And it sounded like for a very long time, the only two teams that were in the running were Miami and Milwaukee. And I mean, he mentioned it like, it's the year after you won a championship with a guy who was a very important
Yeah.
part of it. And I do the math like, well, wasn't exactly the year after the
Right.
championship since, Bill was traded last summer in 2023. So the Bucks were about 2 years removed from that championship. But all in all, I'm glad it didn't happen. Like that's the first thing that I can say. I'm glad that it didn't happen. Bradley Beal trade rumors and the Bucks had been swirling for a while. That's something I heard a lot of Bucks fans being interested in whenever Bradley Beal's name came up as a trade candidate. But I've always been somebody who was like, I would rather have, the 6'7", 6'8" forward over the 6'4" guard on the team, especially given the fact that there are people who have a lot of health concerns around Khris Middleton. But Bradley Beal has also had a track record himself of quite a few injuries. So for me, that never made sense as a swap. But all in all, like I can see why the Bucks were kicking the tires around it. Like that's what you're supposed to do. You got to go out, see what the offers are, make sure you're making the best decisions for your team. So all in all, again, I am glad that it did not happen for the Milwaukee Bucks.
And there was a lot that Bradley Beal got into in this conversation of the scholarship that he had that was yanked away from North Carolina. His reliableness as a narrator comes into question when you hear him talking about, well, I missed, what was it, 30 some games with the Suns last year, and we still won this many games and we're the 6th seed. I mean, if I was healthy, we would have been a top 2 seed.
Yeah.
Also said the 2017 Wizards would have beaten the 2017 Cavaliers. It's like, oh, okay, now you're really starting to lose me here. But he was traded to the Suns. I'm trying to pull up when that even was and
I think
look
it
at
was
the
like
time.
June of 2023. Like I feel like it was like right after the season ended.
Right. It was clearly before the Dame trade. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess my point on that is, so if we go backwards, I guess that means you keep Drew Holiday and you don't
Mm-hmm.
trade for Damian Lillard, and you say, okay, here's the score that we have. You mentioned, which was going to be my follow-up question to you, is do you feel better about not doing this? And you said yes. I do too. And at the risk of, being accused of, well, you guys just stumped for the Bucks and Khris Middleton, you mentioned, the games played, and it hasn't been too sterling for Bradley Beal either. But the other big piece was you're going to have to extend Drew Holiday. And we saw the money that he got from the Boston Celtics. There's no reason to believe he wouldn't have gotten that same payday from the Bucks. Bradley Beal is making more money than Khris Middleton, a lot more. So that's the other piece of it, is who else would have been going out in this trade? And I would presume, just as we saw the Blazers do with Drew, Khris would have been rerouted to a contender and wouldn't be staying in DC with the Wizards. But if we just look at the construction of the roster then, and you say, okay, here we have Khris Middleton essentially making the same money this year as Drew Holiday is with the Phoenix, or with the Boston Celtics. Bradley Beal is making the amount of money, that chunk or close to it, that Damian Lillard is. So if that was your makeup of, well, the Khris money goes to Drew, and then we're giving the Dame money to Bradley Beal, and we have Giannis, I mean, financially, it's right around the same that you're paying out, but I don't think that's a better team.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So, like, the question is, which big three, like, do you think would take the Bucks further? Do you think a big three of Giannis, Drew, and Bradley Beal would have gone farther, or one with Giannis and Dame and Khris Middleton? And we can get into that even more in the next segment. But
Yeah.
for where I'm sitting at, I think, again, when you have Damian Lillard and you have Giannis, the top end talent there is just greater than the top end talent of the trio with Giannis, Beal, and Drew. And that's no disrespect to a Bradley Beal or to Drew Holiday, because we know the importance of Drew Holiday. In that situation, Drew Holiday would have slotted down to a third option for the Bucks. But if you can get top end talent like Damian Lillard, who is the best second guy of all those different trios, like
Well, not
that's
according
where
to
I'm
the
going.
list that was just put out recently.
Well, if yes, not according to that, or I mean, not a top 5 point guard either, according to the GM survey. But I think I would still hitch my wagon to the current big three that the Bucks have right now, rather than one that involves Bradley Beal, even if that means keeping Drew Holiday around.
All right, some more numbers that we'll share on the contracts, because I think the Bucks would have actually been more expensive as we look things over if that was the route that they went down. And again, somebody else is gone. There's another contract you need to make up to bring in Bradley Beal, so that's another big piece of it. So we'll get into that. And as you mentioned too, which would be your preferred big three? The trio of Giannis, Drew Holiday, and Bradley Beal, or what we currently have right now? So we'll get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, and do it all on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Doesn't even have to win, just place your first $5 bet and you get $200 in bonus bets. To get started, head over to FanDuel.com. So, and apologies for not putting together any graphics on this for those watching on YouTube, because I know nothing better than just spouting out numbers and having to keep track of it in your head here. But if, again, looking at the contracts, Dame and Giannis are both making that same max figure at $48.7 million this year. It goes up to $54.1 million next year. Khris Middleton was making slightly more on the old deal annually than he is now, but this year's salary is $31.6 million. So if we go to the Celtics, and again, I'm assuming it's the same deal that Drew Holiday is signing, or at least very close with the Bucks. He's making $30 million this year, $32 million next year, $32 million the year after that, actually $34 million, and then he has the player option. Bradley Beal, though, is making $50.2 million this year. It goes up to just under $54 million next year, and then he has a player option for $57.1 million in the 26-27 season. That same season is the final year that Giannis and Dame are either under contract or theoretically under contract. Giannis is under contract through that season, then has the player option. Dame is under contract through 26 and has a player option for 26-27. But that figure is $58 million for those two. So you're already getting to the point where Bradley Beal is making just as much money as Giannis and Damian Lillard or more in the short term. So it's an even more expensive team for the Bucks. And think about how much we spent talking about the second apron, and boy, how do you get under this thing, and some of the maneuverability that you have with it. And also take into account the fact that, again, Bradley Beal's contract and where it was, I believe it was about $10 million more annually than Khris Middleton. So you got to throw someone else in there. And Camille, I already know who everybody was going to suggest would be thrown in there, but I would just push back with, what's the motivation for the Wizards to take that? Of, what are the other assets that they're getting out of this? Again, as much as we love and stand for Khris Middleton, there's more value in Drew Holiday being rerouted than there was Khris Middleton. So I think that was a big part of why we didn't think the Bucks had the assets to get Dame. They did, because part of it was, well, we can get more assets with Drew Holiday. You could get assets with Khris Middleton. You're not getting as much, I don't believe, as you did for Damian Lillard or for Drew Holiday.
Well, I mean, again, there were some injury concerns there with Khris Middleton at that time as well. I mean, they're still around on Khris Middleton as we speak. We just spent the whole first segment going on about, well, he might play in a preseason, and what is his schedule going to look like for the Bucks, so on and so forth. And think about that too, because right before this trade was made last summer, before that was a 2022-23 season. Khris Middleton only played 33 games in that particular season. So when you're talking about value around the league and what you could get, yeah, you're going to get more from a Drew Holiday at that point than you are from a Khris Middleton. But I still, again, love Khris Middleton's fit with this team, especially next to Giannis, I think the second longest tenured duo in the NBA behind Draymond and Steph at this point. So again, a lot of chemistry, a lot of history between those two. But one other thing that this just said to me, which we always hear it with Giannis saying, like, I don't want to be GM. That's not my job. I just want to go out and hoop. The fact that this was something being shopped around where it's like, hey, it's Khris Middleton. And we know how Giannis feels about Khris. I mean, we saw his reaction to Drew being traded where he was just like, this is bittersweet. Like, I don't know how to deal with this. Like, I'm happy we have Dame, but I'm sad to see Drew go. To hear that was something on the table where Bradley Beal was like, my two options are Milwaukee and Miami. Like, it goes to show again, like, I don't think that Giannis is playing GM Giannis. I definitely think the team comes to him, and asks for his opinion on certain things. But this also just said to me, like, maybe Giannis isn't as locked into all of the contract or the trade talks as some people might think. And to Giannis's point of him saying, like, I don't want to get involved in that. Another reason why he wouldn't want to, hearing that this was even on the table.
And it's a good point on that. That it wasn't even that. Look at how far it got. If we're to believe what Bradley Beal said, it was straight up offered, and it was up to Bradley Beal with the no trade clause. My big takeaway from all of this is basically that just Bradley Beal just didn't want to come to Milwaukee. I don't really think it was the loyalty thing. It's what was his exact quote of the loyalty part that didn't sit right with me, that they would be trading Khris. I mean, I think this was just I'd rather go to Miami and let's see if we can find something else here. So that was my big takeaway from it. And I think the other thing when we're talking about cobbling together the contracts to make it work, Grayson Allen was who went out in the Drew Holiday trade. But again, if we just revisit this, it made sense. It worked because of the three teams involved, because Portland was getting an asset from the Suns in DeAndre Ayton, and they also said, we can get more assets from Drew Holiday or for Drew Holiday. If this was just a straight up Bucks and Wizards trade, I don't see that being the package of Khris Middleton and Grayson Allen, or Khris Middleton and Pat Connaughton, and assets that the Bucks don't have to get this done. So I'm very curious what else would have been there. And it just leads you to believe this had to have been a multi-team trade.
You would believe, yeah, I could see why you would go that route too. And I wish we could get like a book of like the what ifs, like NBA trade history, what if certain things that had been on the table but were taken off for whatever reason, and just thinking about
Let's get somebody that works in the league office that gets the trades that come through of, okay, we have this, we're just waiting for the teams to sign off on it and physicals to go through. Like, send me a history of all the trades that nearly happened but didn't.
Because it's so interesting to think about how different the course of the team's histories could have gone, or what those lineups might have looked like for him. But all in all, it sounded to me like Bradley Beal wanted to go somewhere warm where he also had a chance to win. Him focusing on Miami so much, like, what's Miami on? What's Miami on? Okay, I hear Milwaukee. Yeah, business decisions, so on and so forth. And then just his reaction as well when his agent brought up, well, how do you feel about Phoenix? And he goes like, wait, really? Like, who goes out? Because if it's Book, I'm not interested. And they're like, no, Book stays. And he's like, well, if KD and Book wants him, and he mentioned that was the only team that felt like they really wanted him, where he heard from the stars who were, prepped or told about the possible trade going on. And he hears from KD, he hears from Book, he feels wanted, he feels welcome. And then he adds, and you can't beat the weather. And I love Milwaukee, born and raised here, so on and so forth. But we know how the winters can get. It can get cold. It doesn't have some of the luxuries that a Miami has, doesn't have the same heat or the weather pattern as a Phoenix. So like some players, that's really important to them, the quality of life around them as well. So I'm not saying you can't have a good one here in Milwaukee. I'm just saying that if you're a warm-blooded person, Milwaukee, Miami, and Phoenix it's a different ball game there.
Yeah, I mean, it just reaffirms it, hearing him talk about the Suns and everything else of like, yeah, I mean, maybe there was a part of you that was a little skittish, and maybe he did view it as, boy, I don't know, I'm going to be the guy that's coming in and not so much for the fan base, because as we've unfortunately seen, it's very polarizing, whether or not your team Khris Middleton or not. But when you look at it from Bradley Beal's perspective of, man, Khris was Giannis's guy, and now I'm coming in to replace him, like that adds some more pressure as well into the mix. So I just took it as, yeah, I didn't really want to go to Milwaukee is the gist of everything that Bradley Beal had to say. But it was interesting to hear everything he got into. Again, the scholarship offer that he had from North Carolina that was pulled, proclaiming that his Wizards would have beaten LeBron's Cavs, and also that the Suns would have been the 1 seed last year if he was healthy. Leave your thoughts in the comments. As we said, those big threes, the hypothetical big three of Giannis, Bradley Beal, and Drew Holiday, or what we have now with Giannis, Damian Lillard, and Khris Middleton. Which is your preferred? It'll be very interesting to see where the Bucks fans come down on that one. And look, I hesitate to even put this out there because you ended up getting Damian Lillard later that summer, but for some fans, is this one of those, not quite to this level, but one of those, man, the Bucks could have had Steph Curry in a different trade? Like, is that how you're going to view this? Oh, we could have had Bradley Beal.
Gosh, I listen, I think Bradley Beal is a hooper, for sure. But if there is anyone who is that high on Bradley Beal, please drop it in the comments and I will be there just to get a better understanding. Because that Steph Curry trade, in retrospect, when you look back, it's like, man, because you saw what Steph developed into. Bradley Beal. I don't feel as strongly about that one as I do or would about the Steph Curry if I'm just going back and rewriting history there. But I'll be curious to know what people think about it overall, because that's an interesting one. Which big three would you rather have? And again, I'm with the current iteration of it that the Bucks currently have, especially if Dame is going to be hooping the way that he's talked about. He should be all summer long going into this season with more stability, with better understanding, and with a chance to work out. I'm really, really excited for what this season can hold for the Milwaukee Bucks.
Yeah, leave your thoughts in the comments. I'll be curious as well to see where Bucks fans come down on this one, on the trade that would have netted the Bucks Bradley Beal. We did have the GM survey as well, so we got some results to update you on with that. We will get into that on tomorrow's show, and also preview preseason game number 2. Maybe we'll have more clarity on the status officially of Giannis, though as we said, it sounds like he's playing. And more importantly, Gary Trent Jr. and possibly even Khris Middleton. That will do it for today's show, though. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.